Chapter 11 of The Dinner Club by Sapper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A glass of whisky. It's as easy as shelling peas to be a detective in fiction, grunted the barrister. He's merely the author of the yarn disguised as a character, and he knows the solution before he starts. But the reader doesn't, if the story is told well, objected the doctor, and that's all that matters. Oh, I grant you that, said the barrister, lighting a cigar. I'm not inveighing against the detective story. I love 'em. All I'm saying is that in life a detective's job is a very different matter to, well, take the illustrious example, to that of Sherlock Holmes. He's got to make the crime fit to the clues, not the clues fit into the crime. It's not so terribly difficult to reconstruct the murder of the Prime Minister from a piece of charred paper discovered in the railway refreshment room at Bath, in fiction. It's altogether a different matter in reality. The soldier thoughtfully filled his pipe. And yet there have been many cases when the reconstruction has been made on some clue almost equally flimsy, he murmured. A few, conceded the barrister, but 9 out of 10 are built up with laborious care. The structure does not rest on any one fact, but on a whole lot of apparently unimportant and trivial ones. Of course, it's more spectacular to bring a man to the gallows because half a brick was found lying on the front doorstep, but in practice it doesn't happen. It does, sometimes, remarked a quiet, sandy-haired man who was helping himself to a whisky and soda. It does, sometimes, you man of law. Your remarks, coupled with my present occupation, remind me of just such a case. Your present occupation appears to be drinking whisky, said the doctor, curiously. Precisely, returned the other. Almost as prosaic a thing as our legal luminary's half-brick. He settled himself comfortably in a chair, and the others leaned forward expectantly. And yet on that very ordinary pastime hinged an extremely interesting case, one in which I was lucky enough to play a principal part. The night is yet young, old man, said the barrister. It's up to you to prove your words and duly confound me. The sandy-haired man took a sip of his drink. Then he put the glass on the table beside him and began. Well, if it won't bore you, I'm agreeable. I'll tell you the whole thing exactly as it took place, only altering the names of the people involved. It happened before the war, in that hot summer of 1911, to be exact. I'd been working pretty hard in London, and about the end of July I got an invitation to go down and stop with some people in Devonshire. I will call them the Marleys, and they lived just outside a small village on the north coast. The family consisted of old Marley, who was a man rising 60, and his 2 daughters, Joan and Hilda. There was also Jack Fairfax, through whom, as a matter of fact, I first got to know them. Jack was about my own age, 30-odd, and we'd been up at Cambridge together. He was no relation to old Marley, but he was an orphan, and Marley was his guardian, or had been when Jack was a youngster. And from the very first, Jack and the old man had not got on. Marley was not everybody's meat, by a long way, rather a queer-tempered, secretive blighter, and Jack Fairfax had the devil of a temper at times. When he was a boy, he had no alternative except to do as his guardian told him, but even in those days, as I gathered subsequently, there had been frequent storms. and when he came down from Cambridge there were 2 or 3 most unholy rows, which culminated in Jack leaving the house for good. It was apparently this severance from the 2 girls, whom he had more or less regarded as sisters, which caused the next bust-up. And this one, according to Jack, was in the nature of a volcanic eruption. The 2 girls had come up to London to go through the season with some aunt, and Jack had seen a good deal of them, with the net result that he and Joan had fallen in love with each other. Then the fat was in the fire. Jack straightway had gone down to Devonshire to ask old Marley's consent. Old Marley had replied in terms which, judging from Jack's account of the interview, had contained a positive profusion of unparliamentary epithets. Jack had lost his temper properly, and, well, you know, the usual thing. At any rate, the long and the short of it was that old Marley had recalled both his daughters from London, and had sworn that if he ever saw Jack near the house again, he'd pepper him with a shotgun. To which Jack had replied that only his grey hairs and his gout saved Mr. Marley from the biggest hiding he'd ever had in his life, even if not the biggest he deserved. With which genial exchange of playful badinage I gathered the interview ended. And that was how matters stood when I went down in July 1911. For some peculiar reason the old man liked me, even though I was a friend of Jack's. And in many ways I quite liked him, though there was always something about him which defeated me. Of course, he had a foul temper, but it wasn't altogether that. He seemed to me at times to be in fear of something or somebody. And yet, though I say that now, I don't know that I went as far as thinking so at the time. It was an almost indefinable impression, vague and yet very real. The 2 girls were perfectly charming, though they were both a little afraid of their father. How long it would have taken Joan to overcome this timidity and go to Jack without her father's consent, I don't know. And incidentally, as our legislators say, the question did not arise. Fate held the ace of trumps and proceeded to deal it during my visit. The sandy-haired man leant back in his chair and crossed his legs deliberately. "I think it was about the 4th day after I arrived," he went on, after a while, "that the tragedy happened. We were sitting in the drawing-room after dinner, a couple of men whose names I forget, and a girl-friend of Hilda's. Hilda herself was there, and Joan, who seemed very preoccupied, had come in about a quarter of an hour previously. I noticed that Hilda had looked at her sister inquiringly as she entered, and that Joan had shrugged her shoulders, but nothing had been said, and naturally I asked no questions, with the others there, though from the air of suppressed excitement on Joan's face I knew there was something in the wind. Old Marley himself was not with us. He was in his study at the other end of the house. The fact was not at all unusual. He frequently retired to his own den after dinner, sometimes joining the rest of the party for a few minutes before going to bed, more often not appearing again till the following morning. And so we all sat there talking idly, with the windows wide open and the light shining out onto the lawn. It must have been somewhere about 10 to a quarter past, when suddenly Hilda gave a little scream. "What do you want?" she cried. "Who are you?" I swung round in my chair to find a man standing on the lawn outside, in the centre of the light. He was facing us, and as we stared at him, he came nearer till he was almost in the room. and the first thing that struck me was that he looked a little agitated. "You will excuse me appearing like this," he said, "but—" He broke off and looked at me. "Might I have a word with you alone, sir?" I glanced at the others. Obviously he was a stranger. No trace of recognition appeared on anyone's face. "What is it?" I cried. "What can you possibly want to speak to me about that you can't say now?" He shrugged his shoulders slightly. "As you will," he answered. "My idea was to avoid frightening the ladies. In the room at the other end of the house a man has been murdered." For a moment everyone was too thunderstruck to reply. Then Hilda gave a choking cry. "What sort of man?" she said breathlessly. "An elderly man of, I should think, about 60," returned the other gravely, and Hilda buried her face in her hands. "I will come with you at once, sir," I said hurriedly, and the two other men rose. Instinctively, I think, we all knew it must be old Marley. There was no one else it could be, but the sudden shock of it had dazed us all. I glanced at Joan. She was staring at the man like a girl bereft of her senses, and I put my hand reassuringly on her shoulder. And then she looked up at me, and the expression in her eyes pulled me together. It was like a cold douche, and it acted instantaneously, because it wasn't horror or dazed stupefaction that I read on her face. It was terror, agonized terror. And suddenly I remembered her air of suppressed excitement earlier in the evening. Once again the sandy-haired man paused, while the others waited in silence for him to continue. "It was old Marley right enough," he went on quietly. "We walked round the front of the house until we came to the window of his study, and there instinctively we paused. The window was open, and he was sitting at his desk, quite motionless. His head had fallen forward, and on his face was a look of dreadful fear. For a while none of us moved. Then, with an effort, I threw my leg over the window-sill and entered. "He's quite dead," I said, and I felt my voice was shaking. "We'd better send for the police." The others nodded, and in silence I picked up the telephone. "Mr. Marley's been killed," I heard myself saying. "Will you send someone up at once?" And then, for the first time, I noticed the poker lying beside the chair, and saw the back of the old man's head. It was not a pretty sight, and one of the other men staying in the house, a youngster, turned very white and went to the window. "Pretty obvious how it was done," said the stranger quietly. "Well, gentlemen, nothing ought to be touched in this room until the police arrive. I suggest that we should draw the curtains and go somewhere else to wait for them." I don't think any of us were sorry to fall in with this suggestion. I also don't think I ever drank such a large whisky and soda as I did a few minutes later. Discovering the body had been bad enough. Breaking the news to the two girls was going to be worse. It was Joan who met me in the hall, and we stared at one another in silence. Then I nodded my head stupidly. "It's father," she whispered. "Oh, my God!" I put out my hand to steady her, and she was looking at me with a fixed stare. "Don't you understand?" she muttered hoarsely, and swallowing all the time. "Don't you understand? Jack has been here to-night." "Jack?" I looked at her foolishly. "Jack?" And then her full meaning struck me. "How did that man find out?" she whispered. "And who is he?" "I don't know. I'll go and ask him." I was still trying to adjust this new development, and her next words seemed to come from a great distance. "Do something! For God's sake, do something!" Then she turned and left me, and I watched her go up the stairs, walking stiffly and clinging to the banisters. So Jack had been there, and old Marley was dead, murdered, hit on the head with a poker, and Jack had been there. It's only in romantic fiction that the reader is expected to assume the impossibility of the hero committing a crime, owing to the extreme beauty of his nature. And this wasn't romantic fiction. It was hard, brutal reality. The two facts stood there side by side in all their dazzling simplicity. Jack's nature was not supremely beautiful. He was an ordinary man with the devil of a temper when it was roused. Mechanically, I started to walk back to the room where I had left the other three men. They were sitting in silence when I entered, and after a while the stranger got up. "A dreadful thing to happen," he said gravely. "May I ask, sir," I began, "how you came to discover it?" "Very simply," he answered. "I was strolling along the road, going back to the village inn where I have been stopping for 2 or 3 nights, when I saw the window of the room through the trees. The light was shining out, and I could see someone sitting at the desk. More out of idle curiosity than anything else, I paused for a moment or two, and then something began to arouse my suspicions. The man at the desk seemed so motionless. I thought perhaps he had fainted, or was ill, and after a little hesitation I went in at the gate and looked through the window. To my horror, I saw he was dead, and I at once came round to the other room from which the light was shining, and where I found you. There is a point which may have some bearing on the crime," he continued after a pause. "On my way up from the inn a man passed me. He was coming from this direction, and seemed to me to be in a very excited condition. It was his obvious agitation that made me notice him at the time, though in the dim light I couldn't see his face very clearly. But he was swinging his stick in the air and muttering to himself. At the moment I didn't think much about it, but now—" He shrugged his shoulders slightly. "Of course, I may be completely wrong, but I think it is a thing worth mentioning to the police." "Would you know the man again?" I asked, trying to speak quite normally. "Well, he was tall, 6 feet at least, and broad, and he was clean shaven." He spoke thoughtfully, weighing his words. "I might know him again, but I wouldn't swear to it. One has to be doubly careful if a man's life is at stake." I turned away abruptly. Jack was tall and broad and clean shaven. Strive as I would, the deadly suspicion was beginning to grip me that Jack, in a fit of ungovernable passion, had killed the old man. And at such moments, whatever may be the legal aspect of the matter, one's main idea is how best to help a pal. If Jack had indeed done it, what was the best thing to do? I rang the bell and told the scared-looking maid to bring the whisky and some glasses. Then, with a muttered apology, I left the room. I felt I wanted to talk to Joan about it. I found her dry-eyed and quite composed, though she was evidently holding herself under control with a great effort, and briefly I told her what the stranger had said. She heard me out in silence, then she spoke with a quiet assurance that surprised me. "If Jack did it," she said, He doesn't know he's done it. He doesn't know he's killed father." She faltered a bit over the last word, and I didn't interrupt. "What I mean is this," she went on after a moment. "I know Jack better than anyone else. I know those rages of his when he sees red. But they're over in a minute. He's capable of anything for a second or two. But if he'd done it, Hugh, if he'd hit father and killed him, his remorse would have been dreadful. He wouldn't have run away. I'm certain of that. That's why I say that if Jack did it, he doesn't know he killed him." I said nothing. There was no good telling her that it wasn't one blow, nor yet two or three, that had been used. There was no good telling her that it was no accidental thing done unwittingly in the heat of a moment, that it was an absolute impossibility for the man who had done it to be in ignorance of the fact. And yet, though I realized all that, her simple conviction put new hope into me. Illogical, I admit, but I went downstairs feeling more confident. I found that the local police had arrived, a sergeant and an ordinary constable, and had already begun their investigations. The principal evidence, of course, came from the stranger, and he repeated to them what he had already told me. His name, apparently, was Lenham, Victor Lenham, and the police knew he had been stopping at the local inn. "You saw the body through the window, sir?" said the sergeant, and then went round to the drawing-room. "That is so, Sergeant." "You didn't go into the room?" "Not until later, with these gentlemen. You see," he added, "I've seen death too often not to recognize it. And as, in a way, you will understand, it was no concern of mine, I thought it advisable to have some member of the house itself with me before entering the room." "Quite, sir, quite." The sergeant nodded portentously. "Is there anything else you can tell us?" "Well," said Lenham, "there is a point which I have already mentioned to this gentleman." He glanced at me, and then, turning back to the sergeant, he told him about the man he had passed on the road. And it was when he came to the description that suddenly the constable gave a whistle of excitement. The sergeant frowned on him angrily, but the worthy P.C., whose only experience of crime up to date had been assisting inebriated villagers home, had quite lost his head. "Mr. Fairfax, Sergeant," he exploded. "He was down here to-night, caught the last train, he did. Jenkins at the station told me, sure thing." "Good heavens, Sergeant," I said angrily, "what the devil is the man talking about? He surely doesn't suppose that Mr. Fairfax had anything to do with it?" But the mischief was done. The sergeant formally told off his indiscreet subordinate, but it was obvious that it was merely an official rebuke. In a village like that, every one knows everybody else's private affairs, and the strained relations between the dead man and Jack Fairfax were common property. I could see at a glance that the sergeant regarded the matter as solved already. "Would you recognize this man again, sir?" he demanded, and Lenham gave him the same guarded reply as he had already given to me. He might, but he wouldn't swear to it. It was impossible to be too careful in such cases, he repeated, and it was practically dark when he had passed the man. It was all duly noted down, and then we adjourned to the room of the tragedy. The constable, a ruddy-faced young man, turned pale when he saw the body, Then he pulled himself together and assisted the sergeant in his formal examination. I didn't blame him. We were all feeling the strain, somewhat naturally. Lenham seemed the least concerned, but it wasn't a personal matter with him as it was with us, especially with me. All the time I was fidgeting round the room, subconsciously watching the stolid sergeant making notes, but with only one thought dominating my brain: how best to help Jack. Not that I had definitely made up my mind that he'd done it, but even at that stage of the proceedings I realized that appearances were against him. And Joan's words were ringing in my head. For God's sake, do something. After a while I crossed the room to a small table on which a tantalus of whisky and 2 glasses were standing. I looked at the tray with unseeing eyes, an Indian silver one which old Marley had been very proud of, and then, mechanically, I picked up the glasses. I don't know why I did so. The action was, as I say, mechanical. They had been used, both of them. They had been used for whisky, one could tell that by the smell. And when I put the glasses down again on the tray, the sergeant was approaching with his notebook. The sandy-haired man paused, with a reminiscent smile. Ever noticed how extraordinarily dense you can be at times, even when a plain fact stares you straight in the face? There was one staring at me for 10 minutes that night before my grey matter began to stir. "Just hold on a minute," interrupted the barrister. "Is this plain fact staring us in the face now?" "No, it isn't," conceded the narrator. "At the moment you are in the position of the other people in that room. Mind you, I've left out nothing in order to mystify you. The story, as I have given it to you, is a plain, unvarnished account of what took place. But I'm out to prove your half-brick theory, lawyer man, and to do so with such little storytelling ability as I happen to possess. Now, I won't weary you with what happened during the next week, beyond saying that an inquest and a burglary took place, and the latter, at any rate, was very successful. The former moved along obvious lines, and resulted in Jack Fairfax being arrested for the wilful murder of his guardian, Roger Marley. The evidence was purely circumstantial, but it was about as damning as it could be. Jack admitted to having had an interview with Marley that night. He admitted that they had had an appalling quarrel. What was even worse was that he admitted to having struck the old man in a furious fit of rage. But beyond that, he denied everything. He swore absolutely that the blow he struck Marley could not have killed him. Further, that he had never handled the poker. And then a finger-print expert proved that he had. That was the worst shock of the lot, and his explanation given afterwards that, now he came to think of it, he had picked up the poker to ram the tobacco down in his pipe, convinced no one. He indignantly denied that his action in going up to London by the last train was in any sense running away. He had intended all along to go up by that train, and his reason for leaving the house after the interview without attempting to see his fiancée was that he was in such a rage with her father that he couldn't trust himself to speak to her for fear of what he might say. So much for Jack Fairfax's case. Pretty black, as you will agree. In fact, I don't think I should be exaggerating if I said that there were only 2 people in England convinced of his innocence. And he was one of them. Even Joan's faith was shaken a little. It was on the 10th day after the inquest that I rang up the inspector, who had come over from Exeter to look into the case, with a request that he would come up to the house. I told him that I had certain information which might interest him, and suggested that he might care to hear it. I also rang up Lenham at the inn, and asked him if he would mind coming along at the same time. I told him I'd discovered the burglar. By the way, I didn't tell you that it was his room that had been burgled. In about half an hour they arrived, and the local sergeant as well. "What's this about my burglar?" laughed Lenham. "As far as I can see, he didn't take anything." "All in good time," I answered, smiling. "I've found out a lot of strange things in town." Lenham looked at me quickly. "Oh, you have been to London?" he inquired. "Yes," I answered, "for 2 days. Most entertaining." And then the inspector chipped in impatiently. "Well, sir, what is it you want to say to me?" He looked at his watch suggestively. "First of all, Inspector," I said quietly, "I want to ask you a question. Have you ever heard the legal maxim, falsus in uno, falsus in omne?" I could see that he hadn't the faintest idea what I was driving at. I could also see that Lenham's eyes had suddenly become strained. "It means," I went on, "that if a witness, let us say, is proved to have told one lie, there is strong presumptive evidence that he has told several. At any rate, the value of his statement is greatly diminished. Do you agree?" "Certainly," he answered, "but I don't see—" "You will shortly, Inspector," I remarked. "Now, who would you consider the principal witness against Mr. Fairfax?" "Mr. Fairfax himself," said the inspector promptly. "And leaving him out?" I asked. "Well, I suppose this gentleman here." He nodded towards Lenham, who was sitting quite motionless, watching me. "Precisely," I murmured. "Then why was it necessary for Mr. Lenham to state that his name was Lenham, and further to swear that he had never seen Mr. Marley before, when both those statements were lies?" "What the devil do you mean?" snarled Lenham, rising from his chair. "What do you mean by saying my name is not Lenham?" "You wanted to know about the burglar who took nothing, didn't you?" I said grimly. "Well, I was the burglar, and I took something very valuable, an address." "What on earth—" began the inspector, and then he glanced at Lenham. "I think you'd better sit still, Mr. Lenham," he said quietly, "until we have heard what this gentleman has to say." Lenham sat back in his chair with a venomous look at me. Then he laughed harshly. "By all means, Inspector," he remarked. "Only it is a little disconcerting to be cross-examined suddenly by a man who admits he is a thief." As a matter of fact, the man didn't know how much I knew, or how little, and between ourselves it was deuced little. But watching him closely, I knew I was right, and my only hope was to bluff him into some admission. "Shall we endeavour to reconstruct the events of the night when Mr. Marley was murdered, Mr. Leonard?" I began quietly. "That is your name, is it not? And you are a Corsican?" "Well," he said, "what if I am? I had a very good reason for changing my name." "Doubtless," I agreed. "Let us hope your reason will prove satisfactory to the inspector. May I suggest, however, unless you can supply a better one, that your reason was to avoid the notoriety which would inevitably arise if a foreigner came to stay in a small village like this?" And you were particularly anxious to avoid any possibility of Mr. Marley knowing that a Corsican was in the neighbourhood." He laughed sarcastically. "I think that I've already stated that I have never even seen Mr. Marley," he sneered. "Oh," I remarked. "Then might I ask you, Inspector, to have a look at this photograph? It is old and faded, but the faces are still clear." I handed the photograph to the inspector, and with a sudden curse, the Corsican whipped out a knife and sprang at me. He realized even then that the game was up, and his one thought was to revenge himself on me. But I'd been expecting some such move, and I'd got a revolver handy. Incidentally, revolver shooting is one of the few things I can do, and I plugged him through the forearm before he could do any damage. He stood there, glaring at me sullenly, and then the inspector took a hand. "Stand by that window, Sergeant. Now, Mr. Whatever your name is, no monkey tricks. Do you still deny that you knew Mr. Marley?" "I refuse to answer," snarled the man. "Because this photograph is of you and Marley and a woman taken abroad somewhere." "Naples, to be exact, Inspector," I said. "I found it in his rooms in Berners Street, the address of which I got as the result of my burglary here." The Corsican stood there like a beast at bay, and the inspector's face was stern. "What explanation have you got to give?" he rapped out. "Why did you lie in evidence?" "I refuse to answer," repeated the man. "Since he is so uncommunicative," I remarked, "perhaps you will allow me to reconstruct the crime. Much of it, of necessity, is guesswork. For instance, Lenardi, what was your motive in murdering Mr. Marley?" I rapped the question out at him, and though he'd have killed me willingly if he could have got at me, he didn't deny it. "Well," I continued, "it doesn't matter. Let us assume it was the girl in that photograph. You tracked Marley to earth here in this village. That is all that concerns us. And having tracked him, you bided your time. Vengeance is the sweeter for delay. Each evening you walked up here, watching him through the window, gloating over what was to come. And then one night you found another man with him, Jack Fairfax, and they were quarrelling. At once you saw that this was your opportunity. However skilfully you hid your traces under ordinary circumstances, there was always a grave risk. But here, ready to hand, was a marvellous stroke of luck. Perhaps you crept nearer the window in the darkness, secure in the fact that the room was in a remote part of the house. You saw Jack Fairfax leave, blind with rage, and then, skulking out of the night, you entered the room yourself." "It's a lie!" shouted the Corsican, but his lips were white. "And then old Marley saw you, and the rage on his face was replaced by a dreadful terror. He knew what you had come for. I don't think you wasted much time, Lenardi. You picked up the poker with a gloved hand. Oh, you were taking no chances, and you battered his head in. And then, Lenardi, and then you drank a whisky and soda. And then you decided on a very bold move. You came and alarmed the rest of the house. It was clever of you, but—" The sandy-haired man smiled thoughtfully. "We sprang forward together, the inspector and I, but we were too late. The Corsican had swallowed poison before we could stop him. He was dead in half a minute, and he never spoke again. so I can only assume that my imagination was not far off the rails. "Yes, but hang it, man," said the barrister peevishly, "the whole thing was a pure fluke on your part." "I've never laid any claim to being a detective," murmured the sandy-haired man mildly, rising and helping himself to some more whisky. "All that I said was that there are times when you can build an entire case from your half brick, or its equivalent. And when you find two glasses, both smelling strongly of whisky, in a room, you assume that two people have drunk whisky. Which was where the Corsican tripped up. You see, he distinctly swore he hadn't entered the room till he came in with us." The barrister raised protesting hands to the ceiling. "The man is indubitably mad," he remarked, to no one in particular. "Was not Fairfax in the room most of the evening?" The sandy-haired man looked even more mild. "I think that perhaps I ought to have mentioned one fact sooner, but I was afraid it would spoil the story. The cat has an aversion to water, the fish have an aversion to dry land, but both these aversions pale in total significance when compared to Jack Fairfax's aversion to whisky." He gazed thoughtfully at his glass. "A strange flaw in an otherwise fine character. Thank heavens the symptom is not common." End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of The Dinner Club by Sapper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Man Who Could Not Get Drunk. Yes, she's a beautiful woman. There's no doubt about that. What did you say her name was? I haven't mentioned her name, I returned, but there's no secret about it. She is Lady Sylvia Clavering. Ah, Sylvia. I remember now. He drained his glass of brandy and sat back in his chair, while his eyes followed one of the most beautiful women in London as she threaded her way through the tables toward the entrance of the restaurant. An obsequious head waiter bent almost double as she passed. Her exit, as usual, befitted one of the most be-photographed women of society, and it was not until the doors had swung to behind her and her escort that the man I had been dining with spoke again. "I guess that little bow she gave as she passed here was yours, not mine," he said, with the suspicion of a smile. "Presumably," I answered a little curtly, "unless you happen to know her. I have that privilege." His smile grew a trifle more pronounced, though his eyes were set and steady. "Know her?" He beckoned to the waiter for more brandy. "No, I can't say I know her. In fact, my sole claim to acquaintanceship is that I carried her for 3 miles in the dark one night, slung over my shoulder like a sack of potatoes. But I don't know her." "You did what?" I cried, staring at him in amazement. "Sounds a bit over the odds, I admit." He was carefully cutting the end off his cigar. "Nevertheless, it stands." Now, when any man states that he has carried a woman for 3 miles, whether it be in the dark or not, and has followed up such an introduction so indifferently that the woman fails even to recognize him afterwards, there would seem to be the promise of a story. But when the woman is one of the Lady Sylvia Claverings of this world, and the man is of the type of my dinner companion, the promise resolves itself into a certainty. Merton was one of those indefinable characters who defy placing. You felt that if you landed in Yokohama and he was with you, you would instinctively rely on him for information as to the best thing to do and the best way to do it. There seemed to be no part of the globe, from the South Sea Islands going westward to Alaska, with which he was not as well acquainted as the ordinary man is with his native village. At the time, I did not know him well. The dinner was only our third meeting, and during the meal we confined ourselves to the business which had been the original cause of our running across one another. But even in that short time I had realized that Billy Merton was a white man. And not only was he straight, but he was essentially a useful person to have at one's side in a tight corner. "Are you disposed to elaborate your somewhat amazing statement?" I asked, after a pause. For a moment or two he hesitated, and his eyes became thoughtful. "I don't suppose there's any reason why I shouldn't," he answered slowly. "It's ancient history now, 10 years ago or so." "That was just about the time she was married," I remarked. "She was on her honeymoon when it happened. Well, if you want to hear the yarn, come round to my club." "Why, certainly," I said, beckoning for the bill. "Let's get on at once. I'm curious." "Do you know Africa at all?" he asked me, as we pulled our chairs up to the fire. We had the room almost to ourselves. A gentle snoring from the other fireplace betokened the only other occupant. "Egypt," I answered. "Parts of South Africa. The usual thing. Nothing out of the ordinary." "It was up the west coast that it happened," he began, after his pipe was going to his satisfaction. "And though I've been in many God-forsaken spots in my life, I've never yet struck anything to compare with that place. Nawambi, it was called. Just a few shacks stretching in from the sea along a straggling, dusty street, one so-called shop and a bar. It called itself an hotel, but Lord help the person who tried to put up there. It was a bar, pure and simple, though no one could call the liquor that. Lukewarm gin, some vile substitute for whisky, the usual short drinks, and some local poisons formed the stock. I ought to know. I was the bartender. For about 3 miles inland there stretched a belt of stinking swamp, one vast malaria hotbed. And over this belt the straggling street meandered towards the low foothills beyond. At times it almost lost itself, but if you didn't give up hope or expire from the stench and cast about, you would generally find it again, leading you on to where you felt you might get a breath of God's fresh air in the hills. As a matter of fact, you didn't. The utmost one can say is that it wasn't quite so appalling as in the swamp itself. Mosquitoes. Heavens! They had to be seen to be believed. I've watched them there, literally like a gray cloud. Merton smiled reminiscently. That, and the eternal boom of the sea on the bar half a mile out, made up Nawambi. How any white man ever got through alive, if he had to stop there any length of time, is beyond me. To be accurate, very few did. It was a grave, that place, and only the down and outers went there. At the time, I was one myself. The sole reason for its existence at all was that the water alongside the quay was deep enough for good-sized boats to come in, and most of the native produce from the district inland found its way down to Nawambi for shipment. Once over the belt of swamp, and a few miles into the hills, the climate was much better, and 6 traders, in a biggish way, had bungalows there. They were Dagos, most of them. It wasn't a British part of the west coast. and I frankly admit that my love for the Dago has never been very great. But there was one Scotchman, MacAndrew, amongst them, and he was the first fellow who came into the bar after I'd taken over the job. He was down for the night about some question of freight. "You're new," he remarked, leaning against the counter. "What's happened to the other fellow? Is he dead?" "Probably," I returned. "What do you want?" "Gin, double tot. What's your name?" I told him, and he pondered the matter while he finished his drink. "Well," he said at length, "I warned your predecessor, and I'll warn you. Don't fall foul of my manager down here. Name of Mannering, I do not think. Don't give him advice about keeping off the drink, or he'll kill you. He's killing himself, but that's his business. I'm tough, you look tough, but he's got us beat to a frazzle. And take cover if he ever gets mixed up with any of the Dagos. The place isn't healthy." It was just at that moment that the door swung open, and a tall, lean fellow lounged in. He'd got an eyeglass screwed into one eye, and a pair of perfectly fitting polo boots with some immaculate white breeches encased his legs. His shirt was silk, his sun helmet spotless. In fact, he looked like the typical English dude of fiction. "My manager, Mannering," said MacAndrew, by way of introduction. Mannering stared at me for a moment or two, then he shrugged his shoulders. "You look sane. However, if you come here, you can't be. Double gin, and one for yourself." He spoke with a faint, almost affected drawl, and as I poured out the drinks, I watched him covertly. When he first came in, I had thought him a young man. Now I wasn't so sure. It was his eyes that made one wonder as to his age. They were so utterly tired. If he was indeed drinking himself to death, there were no traces of it yet on his face, and his hand, as he lifted his glass, was perfectly steady. But those eyes of his, I can see them now. The cynical bitterness, the concentrated weariness of all hell was in them, and it's not good for any man to look like that, certainly not a man of 35, as I afterwards discovered his age to be. Merton paused and sipped his whiskey and soda, while from the other side of the room came indications that the sleeper still slept. "I never found out what his real name was," he continued thoughtfully. "Incidentally, it doesn't much matter. We knew him as Mannering, and the J which preceded it in his signature was assumed to stand for James or Jimmy. Anyway, he answered to it, which was the main point. As far as I know, he never received a letter, and he never read a paper, and I guess I got to know him better than anyone else in that hole. Every morning, punctual to the second, at 11 o'clock, he'd stroll into the bar and have 3 double gins. Sometimes he'd talk in his faint, rather pleasant drawl. More often he'd sit silently at one of the rickety tables, staring out to sea with his long legs stretched out in front of him. But whichever he did, whatever morning it was, you could always see your face in his boots. I remember once, after I'd been there about a month, I started to pull his leg about those boots of his. "Take the devil of a long time cleaning them in the morning, don't you, Jimmy?" I said, as he lounged up to the bar for his 3rd gin. "Yes," he answered, leaning over the counter so that his face was close to mine. "Got any further things to say about my appearance?" "Jimmy," I replied, "your appearance doesn't signify one continental damn to me. But as the only 2 regular British habitués of this first-class American bar, don't let's quarrel." He grinned, a sort of slow, lazy grin. "Think not?" he said. "Might amuse one. However, perhaps you're right." And so it went on, one sweltering day after another, until one could have gone mad with the hideous boredom of it. I used to stand behind the bar there sometimes and curse weakly and foolishly like a child, but I never heard Mannering do it. What happened during those steamy nights in the privacy of his own room, when he, like the rest of us, was fighting for sleep, is another matter. During the day he never varied. Cold, cynical, immaculate, he seemed a being apart, above our little worries and utterly contemptuous of them. Maybe he was right. Maybe the thing that had downed him was too big for foolish cursing. Knowing what I do now, a good many things are clear which one didn't realize at the time. Only once, I think, did I ever get in the slightest degree intimate with him. It was latish one evening, and the bar was empty, save for us two. I'd been railing against the fate that had landed me, penniless, in such an accursed spot, and after a while he chipped in his lazy drawl. "Would 1,000 be any good to you?" I looked at him, speechless. £1,000? I stammered. "Yes, I think I can raise that for you." He was staring in front of him as he spoke. "And yet, I don't know. I've got more or less used to you, and you'll have to stop a bit longer. Then we'll see about it." "But good heavens, man," I almost shouted, "do you mean to say that you stop here when you can lay your hand on £1,000? "It appears so, doesn't it?" He rose and stalked over to the bar. "It doesn't much matter where you stop, Merton, when you can't be in the one place where you'd sell your hopes of heaven to be. And it's best, perhaps, to choose a place where the end will come quickly." With that, he turned on his heel, and I watched him with a sort of dazed amazement as he sauntered down the dusty road, white in the tropical moon, towards his own shack. £1,000! The thought of it rang in my head all through the night. £1,000. A fortune. And because, out in death spots like that, men are apt to think strange thoughts that look ugly by the light of day, I found myself wondering how long he could last at the rate he was going. 2, sometimes 3 bottles of gin a day. It couldn't be long. And then, who knew? It would be quick, the break-up. All the quicker because there was not a trace of it now. And perhaps when it came he'd remember about the 1,000, or I could remind him. Merton laughed grimly. "Yes, we're pretty average swine, even the best of us, when we're up against it. And I lay no claims to being a plaster saint. But fate had decreed that Jimmy Mannering was to find the end which he craved for quicker than he had anticipated. Moreover, and that's what I've always been glad about, it had decreed that he was to find it before drink had rotted that iron constitution of his, while his boots still shone and his silk shirts remained spotless. It had decreed that he was to find in it the way of all others that he would have chosen, had such a wild improbability ever suggested itself. Which is going ahead a bit fast with the yarn, but no matter. It was after I'd been there about 3 months that the incident happened which was destined to be the indirect cause of his death. I told you, didn't I, that there were several Dago traders who lived up in the foothills, and on the night in question 3 of them had come down to Nwambi on business of some sort. Amongst them one Pedro Salvas, who was as unpleasant a specimen of humanity as I have ever met. A crafty, orange-skinned brute who indulged, according to common knowledge, in every known form of vice, and a good many unknown ones, too. The three of them were sitting at a table near the door when Mannering lounged in, and MacAndrew's words came back to me. The Dagos had been drinking. Jimmy looked in his most uncompromising mood. He paused at the door and stared at each of them in turn through his eyeglass. Then he turned his back on them and came over to me. I glanced over his shoulder at the three men and realized there was trouble coming. They'd been whispering and muttering together the whole evening, though at the time I had paid no attention. But now Pedro Salvas, with an ugly flush on his ugly face, had risen and was coming towards the bar. "If one so utterly unworthy as I," he snarled, "may venture to speak to the so very exclusive Englishman, I would suggest that he does not throw pictures of his lady-loves about the streets." He was holding something in his hand, and Jimmy swung round like a panther. His hand went to his breast pocket. Then I saw what the Dago was holding out. It was the miniature of a girl. And after that, I didn't see much more. I didn't even have time to take cover. It seemed to me that the lightning movement of Jimmy's left hand as he grabbed the miniature and the terrific uppercut with his right were simultaneous. Anyway, the next second he was putting the picture back in his breast pocket, and the Dago, snarling like a mad dog, was picking himself out of a medley of broken bottles. That was Phase 1. Phase 2 was equally rapid, and left me blinking. There was the crack of a revolver, and at the same moment a knife stuck out quivering in the wall behind my head. Then there was silence, and I collected my scattered wits. The revolver, still smoking, was in Jimmy's hand. Salvas, his right arm dripping with blood, was standing by the door, while his two pals were crouching behind the table, looking for all the world like wild beasts waiting to spring. "Next time," said Jimmy, "I shoot to kill." And he meant it. He was a bit white round the nostrils, which is a darned dangerous sign in a man, especially if he's got a gun and you're looking down the business end of it. And no one knew it better than those three Dagos. They went on snarling, but not one of them moved an eyelid. "Put your knives on that table, you scum," ordered Jimmy. The other two obeyed, and he laughed contemptuously. "Now clear out. You pollute the air." For a moment or two they hesitated. Then Salvas, with a prodigious effort, regained his self-control. "You are brave, Senor Mannering, when you have a revolver and we are unarmed," he said with a sneer. In 2 strides, Jimmy was at the table where the knives were lying. He picked one up, threw me his gun, and pointed to the other knife. "I'll fight you now, Salvas," he answered quietly. "Knife to knife, and to a finish." But the Dago wasn't taking any, and, 'pon my soul, I hardly blamed him. For if ever a man was mad, Jimmy Mannering was mad that night. Mad with the madness that knows no fear and is absolutely blind to consequences. "I do not brawl in bars with drunken Englishmen," remarked Salvas, turning on his heel. A magnificent utterance, but ill-advised with Jimmy as he was. He gave a short laugh and took a running kick, and Don Pedro Salvas disappeared abruptly into the night. And the other two followed with celerity. "You'll be getting into trouble, old man," I said, as he came back to the bar, "if you start that sort of game with the Dagos." "The bigger the trouble, the more I'll like it," he answered shortly. "Give me another drink. Don't you understand yet, Merton, that I'm beyond caring?" And thinking it over since, I've come to the conclusion that he spoke the literal truth. It's a phrase often used, and very rarely meant. In his case, it was the plain, unvarnished truth. Rightly or wrongly, he had got into such a condition that he cared not one fig whether he lived or died. If anything, he preferred the latter. And falling foul of the Dago colony was a better way than most of obtaining his preference. Of course, the episode that night had shown me one thing. It was a woman who was at the bottom of it all. I didn't ask any questions. He wasn't a man who took kindly to cross-examination. But I realized pretty forcibly that if the mere handling of her picture by a Dago had produced such a result, the matter must be serious. Who she was, I hadn't any idea, or what was the trouble between them, and, as I say, I didn't ask. And then one day, a few weeks later, I got the answer to the first question. Someone left a month-old tattler in the bar, and I was glancing through it when Mannering came in. I reached up for the gin bottle to give him his usual drink, and when I turned round to hand it to him, he was staring at one of the pictures with the look of a dead man on his face. I can see him now, with his knuckles gleaming white through the sunburn of his hands, and his great, powerful chest showing under his shirt. He stood like that, maybe for 5 minutes, motionless. Then, without a word, he swung round and left the bar. And I picked up the paper. Merton paused and drained his glass. "Lady Sylvia's wedding?" I asked, unnecessarily, and he nodded. "So the first part of the riddle was solved," he continued quietly. And when 2 days passed by without a sign of Mannering, I began to be afraid that he had solved his own riddle in his own way. But he hadn't. He came into the bar at 10 o'clock at night and leaned up against the counter in his usual way. "What have you been doing with yourself?" I said lightly. "I've been trying to get drunk," he answered slowly, letting one of his hands fall on my arm with a grip like steel. "And, dear God, I can't." It doesn't sound much, told like this in the smoking room of a London club, but though I've seen and heard many things in my life that have impressed me, horrible, dreadful things that I shall never forget, the moment of all others that is most indelibly stamped on my brain is that moment, when, leaning across the bar, I looked into the depths of the soul of the man who called himself Jimmy Mannering, the man who could not get drunk. Once again he paused, and this time I did not interrupt him. He was back in that steaming night, with the smell of stale spirits in his nostrils, and the sight of strange things in his eyes. And I felt that I, too, could visualize that tall, immaculate Englishman leaning against the counter, the man who was beyond caring. "But I must get on with it," continued Merton after a while. "The club will be filling up soon, and I've only got the finish to tell you now. And by one of those extraordinary coincidences which happen far more frequently in life than people will allow, the finish proved a worthy one. It was about 2 days later. I was in the bar polishing glasses when the door swung open and 2 men came in. They were obviously English, and both of them were dressed as if they were going to a garden party. "Thank heavens, Tommy, here's a bar at any rate," said one of them. "I say, barman, what have you got?" Well, I had a bit of liver, and I disliked being called barman. Several bottles of poison, I answered, and a hell of a temper. The second one laughed, and after a moment or two, the other joined in. I don't wonder at the latter commodity, he said. This is a ghastly hole. I wouldn't deny it, I answered. What, if I may ask, has brought you here? Oh, we've had a small breakdown, and the skipper came in here to repair it. We've just come ashore to have a look round. I glanced through the window and noticed for the first time that a steam yacht was lying off the shore. She was a real beauty, looked about 1,000 tons, and I gave a sigh of envy. You're not in want of a barman by any chance, are you? I said. If so, I'll swim out and chance the sharks. Afraid we've got everything in that line, he answered. But select the least deadly of your poisons and join us. And it was as I was pulling down the gin and vermouth that Jimmy Mannering came into the bar. He got about halfway across the floor, and then he stopped dead in his tracks. And I guess during the next 2 seconds you could have heard a pin drop. So this is where you've hidden yourself, said the smaller of the two men, the one who had done most of the talking. I don't think we'll trouble you for those drinks, barman. Without another word, he walked out of the place, and after a moment or two the other man started to follow him. He hesitated as he got abreast of Jimmy, and then for the first time Mannering spoke. Is she here? Yes, answered the other. On board the yacht. There's a whole party of us. And with that he stepped into the street and joined his pal. With a perfectly inscrutable look on his face, Jimmy watched them as they walked through the glaring sun and got into the small motorboat that was waiting alongside the quay. Then he came up to the bar. An artistic touch, doubtless, on the part of fate, he remarked quietly, but a little unnecessary. And I guess I metaphorically took off my hat to him at that moment. What he'd done, why he was there, I neither knew nor cared. All that mattered to me was the way he took that last rotten twist of the surgeon's knife. Not by the quiver of an eyelid would you have known that anything unusual had happened. He drank his 3 double gins at exactly the same rate as every other morning. And then he, too, swung out of the bar and went back to his office in McAndrew's warehouse, leaving me to lie down on my bed and sweat under the mosquito curtains while I wondered at the inscrutable working out of things. Was it blind, the fate that moved the pieces? Or was there some definite pattern beyond our ken? At the moment it seemed pretty blind and senseless. Later on, well, you'll be able to form your own opinion. You know how quickly darkness falls in those latitudes, and it was just before sunset that I saw a boat shoot away from the side of the yacht and come full speed for the shore. I remember I wondered casually who was the mug who would leave a comfortable yacht for Nawabi, especially after the report of it that must have been given by our 2 morning visitors. And then it struck me that, whoever it might be, he was evidently in the deuce of a hurry. Almost before the boat came alongside, a man sprang out and scrambled up the steps. Then, at a rapid double, he came sprinting towards me as I stood at the door of the bar. It was the smaller of the 2 men who had been ashore that morning, and something was evidently very much amiss. "Where is she?" he shouted as soon as he came within earshot. "Where's my wife, you damn scoundrel?" Seeing that he was quite beside himself with worry and alarm, I let the remark go by. "Steady," I said, as he came gasping up to me. "I haven't got your wife. I haven't even seen her." "It's that card sharper," he cried. "By God, I'll shoot him like a dog if he's tried any monkey tricks." "Dry up and pull yourself together," I said angrily. "If you're alluding to Jimmy Mannering—" And at that moment Jimmy himself stepped out of his office and strolled across the road. "You swine! You cursed card cheat! Where's Sylvia?" "What the devil are you talking about?" said Jimmy, and his voice was tense. "She came ashore here this afternoon, saying she would return in an hour," said the other man. "I didn't know it at the time. Mr. Mannering, I believe you call yourself. The boat came back for her, and she was not there. That was 4 hours ago. Where is she?" He was covering Jimmy with his revolver as he spoke. 4 hours ago, Clavering? Good heavens! Man, put down your gun. This isn't a time for amateur theatricals. He brushed past him as if he was non-existent, and came up to me. "Did you see Lady Clavering?" "Not a trace," I answered, and the same fear was in both of us. "Did she say what she was coming on shore for?" He swung round on the husband. "To have a look round," answered Clavering, and his voice had altered. No longer was he the outraged husband. He was a frightened man, relying instinctively on a bigger personality than himself. "If she's not about here, she must have gone inland," said Jimmy, staring at me, "and it'll be dark in 5 minutes." "My God!" cried Clavering. "What are we going to do? She can't be left alone for the night. Lost in this cursed country. She may have hurt herself, sprained her ankle." For a moment neither of us answered him. Even more than he did we realize the hideous danger of a white woman alone in the bush inland. There were worse dangers than snakes and wild animals to be feared. And it was as we were standing there, staring at one another, and afraid to voice our thoughts, that one of MacAndrew's native boys came down the street. He was running and out of breath, and the instant he saw Jimmy, he rushed up to him and started gabbling in the local patois. He spoke too fast for me to follow him, and Clavering, of course, couldn't understand a word. But we both guessed instinctively what he was talking about, and we both watched Jimmy's face. And as we watched it, I heard Clavering catch his breath sharply. At last the boy finished, and Jimmy turned and looked at me. On his face was a look of such cold, malignant fury that the question which was trembling on my lips died away, and I stared at him speechlessly. "The Dagos have got her," he said very softly. "Don Pedro Salvas is, I fear, a foolish man." Clavering gave a sort of hoarse cry, and Jimmy's face softened. "Poor devil," he said. "Your job is going to be harder than mine. Go back to your yacht. Get all your men on shore that you can spare, and if I'm not back in 4 hours, wait for dawn, and then strike inland over the swamp. Find Pedro Salvas' house, and hang him on the highest tree you can find." Without another word, he swung on his heel and went up the street at a long, steady lope. Twice Clavering called after him, but he never turned his head or altered his stride. And then he started to follow. It was I who stopped him, and he cursed me like a child, almost weeping. "Do what he told you," I said. "You'd never find your way, and you'd be worse than useless. I'll go with him. You get back and bring your men ashore." And with that I followed Jimmy. At times I could see him, a faint white figure in the darkness as he dodged through that fever-laden swamp. At times I found myself marveling at the condition of the man, bearing in mind his method of living. Steadily, tirelessly, he forged ahead, and when he came to the foothills, I hadn't gained a yard on him. And then I began wondering what was going to happen when he reached Salva's bungalow, and by what strange mischance the girl had met the owner. That it was revenge, I was certain. He had recognized her from the picture, and I remember thinking how bitter must have been his hatred of Mannering to have induced him to run such an appalling risk. For the risk was appalling, even in that country of strange happenings. I don't think that Jimmy troubled his head over any such speculations. In his mind there was room for only one thought, an all-sufficient thought, to get his hands on Pedro Salvas. I don't think he even knew that I was behind him, until after it was all over and the curtain was falling on the play, and then he had no time for me. Merton gave a short laugh that had in it a touch of sadness. A good curtain it was, too, he continued quietly. I remember I made a frantic endeavor to overtake him as he raced up to the house, and then, because I just couldn't help myself, I stopped and watched, fascinated. The window of the big living room was open, and the light blazed out. I suppose they had never anticipated pursuit that night. Leaning up against the wall was the girl, with a look of frozen horror on her face, while seated at the table were Pedro Salvas and 3 of his pals, and they were drinking. It all happened very quickly. For 1 second I saw Jimmy Mannering framed in the window, then he began shooting. I don't think I've mentioned that he could shoot the pip out of the ace of diamonds 9 times out of 10 at 20 yards. And his madness did not interfere with his aim. And that night he was stark staring mad. I heard 3 shots, so close together that only an artist could have fired them out of the same revolver and taken aim. I saw the 3 friends of Pedro Salvas collapse limply in their chairs. And then there was a pause. I think Jimmy wanted to get at him with his hands. But it was not to be. Just for a moment, the owner of the bungalow had been so stupefied at the sudden appearance of the man he hated that he had simply sat still, staring. But only for a moment. The movement of his arm was so quick that I hardly saw it. I only noticed what seemed to be a streak of light which shot across the room, and then I heard Jimmy's revolver again. The 10th, the 100th of a second too late. He'd drilled Pedro Salvas through the heart, all right. I watched that swine crumple up and fall with the snarl still on his face. But this time the knife wasn't sticking in the wall. She got to him first, went on Merton thoughtfully. His knees were sagging just as I got to the window, and she was trying to hold him up in her arms. And then, between us, we laid him down, and I saw that the end was very near. There was nothing I could do. The knife was clean into his chest. The finish of the journey had come to the man who could not get drunk. And so I left them together, while I mounted guard by the window with a gun in each hand. It wasn't a house to take risks in. He lived, I think, for 5 minutes, and of those 5 minutes I would rather not speak. There are things which a man may tell, and things which he may not. Sufficient be it to say that he may have cheated at cards, or he may not. She loved him. If indeed he had committed the unforgivable sin amongst gentlemen all the world over, He atoned for it, and she loved him. Let us leave it at that. And when it was over, and the strange, bitter spirit of the man who called himself Jimmy Mannering had gone out on the unknown road, I touched her on the shoulder. She rose blindly and stumbled out into the darkness at my side. I don't think I spoke a word to her beyond telling her to take my arm. And after a while she grew heavier and heavier on it, until at last she slipped down, a little unconscious heap of sobbing girlhood. Merton paused and lit a cigarette with a smile. So that is how it was ordained that I should carry Lady Sylvia Clavering slung over my shoulder like a sack of potatoes for 3 miles. I remember staggering into the village to find myself surrounded by men from the yacht. I handed her over to her distracted husband, and then I rather think I fainted myself. I know I found myself in my own bar, with people pouring whiskey down my throat. And after a while they cleared off, leaving Clavering alone with me. He began to stammer out his thanks, and I cut him short. "No thanks are due to me," I said. "They're due to another man, whom you called a card cheat, but who was a bigger man than either you or I are ever likely to be." "Was?" he said, staring at me. "Yes," I answered. "He's dead." He stood there silently for a moment or two. Then, with a queer look on his face, he took off his hat. "You're right," he said. "He was a bigger man than me." Merton got up and pressed the bell. "I've never seen him from that day to this," he said thoughtfully. "I never saw his wife again until tonight. And I've never filled in the gaps in the story. Moreover, I don't know that I want to." A waiter came over to his chair. "You'll join me? 2 whiskeys and sodas, please, waiter. Large ones." End of chapter 12. End of The Dinner Club by Sapper. Recording by Kirsten Wever.